I just, before you start, I wanted to say that thank you for inviting me on. And it is my privilege, my pleasure, I should say, to do this program for such a vitally important charity, the Youth Aliyah Child Rescue. You know, you just have to ring and I'm there. So thank you for inviting me and thank you for sending it all up.
Well, it's our pleasure. You know, we're just intrigued to hear highlights of your wonderful career because it is astonishing. But I want to start literally at the beginning. If you could just share with us a little of your childhood, where you were born and where you went to school.
I was born at the London. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, as you know, you and I were not quite neighbours, but mentally we were neighbours.
We were neighbours, yeah. London Hospital in Whitechapel, Morris, which I think, were you born there?
I was, yeah.
So I think probably because you're younger than me, I didn't stick around to see your birth. I don't think so.
You didn't miss that much.
So I was an East End, I am an East End boy, and I was lucky enough to go to Hackney Downs Grammar School because I lived in Upper Clapton and Lower Clapton. And I went to Hackney Downs Grammar School, which was then known as Grocer's School. And although I didn't appreciate it at the time, it was a great school. And it was a great school because it gave me a great education, but it also, and I don't know if you know this, Morris, or those listening in, the other members of not my class, but of the school were people like Harold Pinter, brilliant Nobel-winning writer or playwright. Michael Caine, who went there for 1 year.
Really?
Before he got evacuated.
I imagine not a lot of people know that.
No, I don't think so. And then, of course, still around, and I'm told very lively, is Lord Levy. So, yes. So, and didn't you tell me there was a pop singer that went to the school that I didn't know, Morris?
Yes, well, there was two. One was Helen Shapiro. And
she didn't go to our school because it was an all-boys school.
Yeah, but she went to school in Upper Clapton. So that's as close as we can get there. And also in the school was, I don't know, because you've been in America such a long time, whether you know of Mark Bolan.
Oh, yes, of course, yes.
Okay, well, he was in her class.
So the East End, Morris, you know, nurtured some interesting characters.
Oh, didn't it just? And I know that when you were at school, you absolutely excelled at sport. What sports in particular? And where did this lead on to?
Well, I love to play, I have to say soccer, because in America, if you say soccer, they understand. If you say football, they think you wear a helmet. So no, I love football. I love cricket. I was on the track, and that kind of gave me a passion for what I went on to cover football before I left for America. So I enjoyed it. And I want to tell you, and this is a silly side note, that when the deputy headmaster used to come to the school, come into our class, and it was raining, and he said the horrible words, "There will be no games today," I was crying. Anyway, I'm kidding slightly, but you know what I mean.
Well, so much so that you were very much involved with Maccabi.
Yes, I was very lucky. I did, and I played in the AJY, and many of those listening will know the Association of Jewish Youth, and that was my passport to international soccer or international football, because I played for England in the Maccabi Games, and we actually won gold medals. And then when I went to America, I played for America in the Maccabi Games, and we actually didn't win any gold medals. Anyway, that's jumping ahead. Go ahead.
What year would that have been?
Oh, that had to be 1959 or thereabouts, just before I went to America.
Well, how did you show an interest in journalism from an early age, or is it something that you discovered later?
I think I wanted to be either a journalist or a policeman. Now, those of you listening in and watching this will probably know that when you wanted to be a policeman, if anybody did, you had to be 5'9" tall. And I'm a little bit shorter than that. So that was my detective career out the window. So I settled for second best which was journalism, which I enjoyed and I have enjoyed for half a century.
Did the school sort of noted your passion for that and push you a little bit into that?
The school did not notice anything because I was not a very good student at Hackney Downs Grammar School. In retrospect, they say education is wasted on the young, and it was a bit wasted on me in the early days. But once I got running as a journalist, I went from strength to strength, I hope, and I improved. So, Morris, I was not a very impressive student.
Okay. Now, as most young men of the era, you did your national service. And I think in a way, this is what sort of kickstarted your ideas, because you became secretary to a very young lieutenant whilst in the army. And we've got a picture here of Roger Bannister. So you worked with him. Tell us briefly about him at that time.
Well, he was famous because he'd run the first man on earth to run the 4-minute mile, under 4 minutes. And so when he came to the Queen Alexandra Military Hospital in Millbank, London, he was famous. And I must say he was a nice guy, and I worked for him. And the sad note was that he was a young doctor, and he was handling cases of young army boys who had gone to Christmas Island to witness the H-bomb test. And what happened? They came down with leukemia, and most of them died. And I remember talking to one of the patients, his name was Sapper Morris, and he told me the story. I said, well, what happened when the bomb went off? He said, we were told to turn our backs and shut our eyes. Well, we know that does not help. And unfortunately, a lot of young guys died. And Roger Bannister was working with these young men.
Because he apart from his athleticism, he went on to do much good work in medical fields, didn't he, with various forms to do with that.
He was phenomenal, and of course he became Sir Roger Bannister.
Yeah.
He was knighted by the Queen, and had a very, very distinguished career.
Well, after you were discharged from the army, you went to work at probably the best university in the world, as many would say. And here we go. This is the best university in the world. A certain establishment. And this was Butlins at Clacton. And I think you had a bit of time there.
I did.
Share with us about that.
I must tell you, this brings back memories. I haven't seen the Gaiety Theatre for 50 odd years or more. But I was going to go to America, Morris, and I decided to earn a few shillings. I went to work. I left my journalism, would you believe, and became public relations director at Butlins Holiday Camp, Clacton. And for those listening to this, you can't believe that people pay 10 quid a week for all the food, all the entertainment, and they were kind of locked in a barbed wire encampment because people couldn't come in. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. And then what happened, as you know, and as most of those listening in, I'm sure know, was what happened was Butlins Holiday Camp gradually kind of subsided, and people discovered in England you could go to the continent for the same amount of money. So Butlins was gone with the wind, but it was an incredible experience, only for 6 months, but I enjoyed it. But I must add, the real reason I'm passionate about Butlins was I met my wife, Sally, from Northern Ireland, and she was working there. What serendipity, what amazing luck.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to talk about Sally. Now, in particular, during your time at Butlins, you worked alongside an extremely talented performer. Do you remember Roy Castle?
Of course. Roy Castle was a redcoat.
Yes.
And the redcoats, for those who don't know, were the kind of superior employees at Butlins because they were talented and they were entertainers, and at night they performed for the Butlins holidaymakers, and many young people who performed at Butlins went on to greater things. You know that, Morris, don't you?
I do. I do. Now, I mean, did you realize his talent back then?
Not particularly, no. I mean, he was another redcoat. He was a charming man with a great personality, but you know, and as I say, I know that we talked about this. There were some other people that went to Butlins, weren't there?
No, there was a lot. There was a lot of people. There was one young boy in particular who was aged about three or four, and a good-looking young boy he was, and that's me, and that's on the beach at Clacton. Now, wow. The story of this is we were always next to the Butlins place, and I used to see the redcoats come down with the children, but because I wasn't staying there, I couldn't play with them. And I was so envious of all the activities they were doing. And as you can see, I've made my own boat out of the sand. And I always said one day I'd go to Butlins, but I never actually did. On the subject of Butlins, I believe it was a certain Butlins in Skegness, where a certain Richard Starkey was playing with a different band. And John Lennon and Paul McCartney went there to see him. And they asked him to join their band, of course, their band being the Beatles. Now, do you know how much they offered him a week to play with them?
Well, I would have said, not really thinking back about the price of things, I would say probably 100 quid a week, but you're going to correct me, aren't you?
I am, because it was £25 a week. But considering what the national wage was at the time, it probably was £100 a week in real terms. Because I think the national wage was about £8 or £10.
Wow.
And he got offered a fortune. Well, after Butlins, you took a giant leap of moving to the USA. So what year would this have been? And what was your first job there?
My first job in the USA was in 1961. I went to America in 1960. I went to America about a week after a fellow called John Kennedy was elected president. He beat a guy called Richard Nixon. Some people may remember. Anyway, I'm being facetious here, sorry. So I went to America and I decided I'd worked in weekly newspapers in London. And I thought, well, I'm the guy that they're all going to hire. So I went to the big Los Angeles Times and I said, I'm here. Can I have a job? And they said, go downstairs to the employment office and fill out a few forms. And of course, I never heard a word from them. So I decided I couldn't walk into it. So I just did a few odd jobs. I worked for a department store. And then one day I got a job for a daily newspaper in San Diego, California. And I was off and running and kind of never looked back. So it wasn't a great job, but I was doing what I wanted to do.
Well, in respect of that, a certain gentleman who was actually English, who spotted your talent, this gentleman was a giant in the world of newspapers. And we're looking at a picture here of David English, who then went on to become Sir David English. And he was very important to you, wasn't he?
He was. David English, I love that picture. I don't know where you got it, because David English was a go-getter. He became editor of the whole Daily Mail organization. But at the time, he was a young foreign correspondent running a bureau in New York for the Daily Express. And somehow we made the connection. And I was in Hollywood at the time, in LA, and I was doing stories for him about Peter Sellers having a heart attack, having married a very young woman. I think Britt Eklund was her name. I'm pretty sure. Correct me if I'm wrong. And I started doing stories, Cary Grant's divorce, Marlon Brando's divorce. And David decided that I had what it took, because about a year or two later, he called me up. He said, the Express is opening a West Coast of America bureau. We want you to be the bureau chief. Well, I mean, who's going to turn that down? And so that was the key, as you said, Morris, that opened the door to my travels around the world and my great adventure.
Well, your great adventure took another great turn, because in 1962, your editor sent you down to Mississippi, He said you had to cover an important historical event. Okay, let's tell the ladies and gentlemen about this.
Yeah, that gentleman is a man called James Meredith. And James Meredith was a young student and he made history. And he made history because the President Kennedy said he should be entitled to enroll at the University of Mississippi, excuse me, in Oxford, Mississippi, not Oxford, England, Oxford, Mississippi. There was bedlam. The governor refused to let him. And President Kennedy sent 700 US Marshals down to Oxford, Mississippi. And that's where I went. I was very lucky. I was young. I looked like a student. They smuggled me on the campus. They didn't want the press there. And I had witnessed the enrollment of Oxford, Mississippi of young James Meredith. But I'll tell you this, a very quick side story, two things. Number one, there were riots, there were shootings. 3 people got killed. One of them was a young journalist, and he was working as a freelance for a London newspaper. For about a day, people wondered, was this me? But then when I called in my story later that day, they said, you're alive, Ivor, thank you, you're alive. And so I knew I was alive then. I mean, it's not, I don't want to joke about it because a young freelance journalist from England did get killed. But the coincidence of 2 journalists being from England, being on the campus was unbelievable. So that was it. And the fact is that Meredith went on, he's still alive. He went on for great things, but every time he went to class, he had 6 US Marshals sitting round him to make sure things were okay. That was quite a story.
Did you realize at the time how important this story was?
I knew it was important from the historical point of view, but to be honest with you, Morris, as I went through my life, I didn't realize things were that important. I mean, you know, you're a young man. There's a statue of the young student, the young James Meredith. He's now a little older. His hair is white and he has a white beard, and but he's still around, and he's still a model of incredible history in the civil rights movement in the United States. But to answer your question, Morris, I didn't have a clue that this was history. I was a reporter. I was doing my job. I wish I had a better sense of history, but I think, and many listening in may agree, that you don't appreciate history until you get a wee bit older.
That's true. That picture of the statue there, it was 50 years to the day that Meredith was awarded a medal, actually, for education impact for the work he'd done with civil rights.
Yes, yes. Well, and he deserved it. And as I say, he's still around, and a beacon of intelligence and wisdom. Yeah,
well, good for him. Let's move on a little bit. Let's go on now to 1964. And you're in LA with the Daily Express. And David English sends you to cover 24 cities tour, which is on for 34 days, with a certain band from Liverpool that were trying to make the grade on their first US tour.
Oh my God, they changed, didn't they?
Yeah. Whatever happened to those angelic faces?
Yeah, I don't know that they were that angelic, but they certainly look angelic, don't they? Well, I'll give you the short version of that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd heard about the Beatles in 1964 because in America, they come over in February 1964 to appear on a show called The Ed Sullivan Show. And it was Ed Sullivan Show was the show. And that was in you've got to realize it was in a time when even in America, there were 5 channels. There were not 948 channels. There were 5 channels. And Ed Sullivan appeared every Sunday night and everybody tuned in. And when the Beatles showed up at his show, 74 million people tuned in. And one of the 74 million was me. And I thought, nice bunch of guys, but why are these girls screaming all the time? Tell me, what's going on?
Were you a Beatles fan?
Not really, no. I did become a Beatles fan when I traveled on the road with them, as you pointed out, because they were great guys. They were very accessible. I hung out with them. I was able to get to know them. But it was kind of a weird situation because the poor Beatles, I'm sorry to say poor Beatles, I don't mean financially poor Beatles, believe me. But at the time they were fairly poor. They weren't rich. The Beatles were trapped in their hotel rooms. They couldn't go outside. They would have been torn limb for limb. And so because I was inside with them, we became, they were stuck with me. So I would hang out with them, and it was a great situation for a reporter.
How did they take to you?
Well, first of all, when I met them, they were jet lagged, and they were sitting in their hotel room in San Francisco, and they were amazed. They were watching film on the television in San Francisco of them arriving at the airport, and they were stunned because the film was in color. Would you believe? Color film. I don't think we had it in England at the time, unless, maybe a few people did. So, I was introduced to them by a guy called Derek Taylor. Now, Derek, those Beatles fans know, was their PR guy. He ghosted Brian Epstein, the manager's book. He used to work for the Daily Express. He was the one who actually introduced me to the Beatles. And once I got the stamp of approval from Derek Taylor, I was in, and I could do whatever I liked, which was terrific.
Do you remember, because you mentioned before about them being trapped, particularly in their hotel, John Lennon had a favorite game that he liked to play. You remember what that was?
Yes, he did. I mean, you've got to realize they were bored at night. And so John Lennon would call me at 2:00 in the morning and say, we're playing Monopoly, come over. So I'd go over with Art Schreiber, who was a wonderful American guy from radio. And we became, Art Schreiber and I are still friends today. And we would play Monopoly with John. But two things I remember. Before we started to play Monopoly, John picked up the phone and at great expense called his wife in Liverpool and goo-gooed and the baby, who was only one. I think it was Julian, was age 1. And that was kind of fun. And then the other thing I'm going to mention, that you should keep this to yourself, is that when John Lennon played Monopoly with us, he cheated. And he cheated because he kept rolling the dice, and only when he got the right number did he move his man and did buy the property. So deep down inside, I guess, and you may not know this, that John Lennon was a property magnate when it came to Monopoly.
Well, carrying on with them, whilst on tour and still with the Daily Express, they assigned you to ghostwrite a weekly newspaper column with this gentleman here. And there's a picture of you. Is that you with George?
Yeah, that's the sophisticated me when I used to smoke those little cigarillos with plastic bits. That's me, and that's George, yes.
How did George feel about you ghostwriting for him?
Well, at that time, George was fairly taciturn. He didn't really have much to say. And so the problem was, and my problem was, I was writing his column, but he would go to bed at 2:00 in the morning and wake up about 11:00 in the morning. And I had my London deadline. So for the first couple of columns, I must admit, I made up the column. And then finally, George was told by his parents, your column is a load of old rubbish. And so he sat down with me in the private jet that we were traveling in and said, it's a load of old rubbish. And he said it in rather stronger language than I've just said. And I said, George, talk to me. Tell me what's going on in your mind. And he opened up a bit, and our relationship improved, but it got off to a rocky start.
Well, obviously the Beatles wouldn't have been anything without a certain manager. And when you eventually met Brian Epstein, because I know you didn't initially meet him, how did the two of you get on?
Well, we actually got on very well for the following reasons. Number one, he knew I was Jewish and I knew he was Jewish. So we had a kind of little kinship there. But the other thing was we had both had to do national service. So Brian told me, and I don't know if people know this, but Brian did national service, but after a few months, they let him go. I think it was because he was openly gay, and so he only served a few months. And he and I talked about how we felt at the time. National service was a bit of a waste of time, but you know, in retrospect, maybe it wasn't a waste of time because I told you the Roger Bannister story, and you live and learn. But so on those elements, it was fine. And the other thing was that Derek Taylor called me. We were going to be Yom Kippur in New Orleans, and Derek called me and said, Brian wants to go to shul. Well, he didn't say shul, he wants to go to the synagogue, he said. So can you arrange for it? So I called the rabbi. I said, I am visiting out of town. I didn't say it was Brian Epstein that wanted to come because I thought that would not be kosher. And so we booked a couple of seats, and the rabbi said, well, it's wonderful. You're from England. We'll take care of you. And then the next morning I went to shul and Brian never showed up. And then when I said what happened to Brian, they said, well, Brian had to go to New York for meetings, and that was it. So with that relationship, the relationship with Brian was quite good. I mean, it wasn't until much later that I discovered, of course, that being homosexual, it was, you know, he was very ashamed of that, and as a result, he kept his private life as private as he could.
Well, the thing with Brian, we could do a whole program just on him alone with so many things. I don't really know, but a reporter once asked Brian, and the question was, how long will the Beatles last? And he so rightly predicted that people in the 21st century will still be listening to them. Now, bearing in mind that was in 63, 64, that prophecy sure came true.
You're absolutely right. And the amazing thing is, when, you know, at the time, you'd think, what a load of old rubbish he's spouting. But look at it today. I mean, you can't open the paper. Well, who opens the paper these days? You can't turn on the telly without finding there's a new miniseries about the Beatles Get Back, and Let It Be. Paul McCartney, I read today, has a new book coming out. Ringo is this. Anyway, so Brian was absolutely right. Brian kept the faith.
He certainly did. You talked very briefly about Ed Sullivan, but when they appeared on Ed Sullivan's show, Sullivan, who was perhaps not the nicest or politest of gentlemen, told Brian Epstein that there was no way his boys were going to be bigger than Elvis. He wasn't quite right, was he?
He wasn't quite right. And the other thing that, as you know, I'm sure, was that they were dickering over what they were going to pay for the Beatles, because Brian very shrewdly knew that exposure on that show would be phenomenal. He just knew it instinctively. So when he got over there, he had to kind of twist Ed Sullivan's arm to get the Beatles on the show. And in fact, to be honest with you, the Beatles were not the headline act. There was, no. I think Mitzi Gaynor or somebody, Mitzi Gaynor, the actress, was a headline act. And as you know, Morris, I'm sure, they worked for pretty much for peanuts.
Well, they did, but I don't know whether you recall an act in America of a sock puppet that was called Topo Gigio, who actually got a higher billing on the Sullivan Show than them.
Yes, I mean, the thing was that Ed Sullivan, we know now, paid not the puppet maybe, but he paid people $10,000, which was a huge amount of money, to be on the show. And as I think you know, Morris, the Beatles negotiated, they got $3,500. But to be honest with you, I think Brian Epstein would have done it for free, because he instinctively knew, get them on this show, coast to coast in America, and it's going to be our passport to success. And he was right. I've got to give it to him. He really was shrewd.
He was, and also that 3,500 was split between the four of them.
Yes, amazing. It's astonishing. Yeah. But you know, they wanted. I mean, the Beatles had not been appreciated, and in looking back, we laugh when we tell those stories.
Well, that's understandable. But the thing at the time, when they wanted Sinatra on the show, they paid him $12,000 for doing one performance.
Yes. Yes.
Well, just coming off of the music side of it a little bit, but obviously still American related. And again, we're talking about real history here. In 1965, you were sent to report on the now infamous Watts riots in Los Angeles. Now, this was a terrible time in America. What's your recollection of all this?
Well, my recollection of the Watts riots were the juxtaposition of the madness of being a reporter then. Around about August of that year, I went down to the Watts riots, and it was the only time in my career that I thought I was going to get killed, because there were snipers on the roof taking shots at people. And the reason that I sort of ran the gauntlet was the Daily Express photographer, a legendary photographer now called Harry Benson, and Harry Benson is still around. And Harry Benson flew in from New York to take the pictures. And when he got to the LA airport and I picked him up, he said, "Take me to the riots." Wow. So I had to drive him to the riots. He got out and like an invisible man started running around shooting pictures. I climbed in the gutter under the car because there were people shooting. And I thought, this guy is crazy. He's gonna be killed. But Harry survived. And as I say, today he's 92 and still very lively. And I thought, well, and then about a week later, from the gutters of the Watts riots, I'm in Elvis Presley's house.
I'm going to come on to that because, as you say, it was a week later. And I understand that you were the only journalist invited to accompany the Beatles along to this man's house, which I understand is in Perugia Way in Bel Air. Now, I've been there, but not like you. I haven't been inside. I've only stood at the front by the music gates. But I can only imagine what it was like to be there. How was it that you were the only journalist that was permitted to be there?
Well, it was I'd heard that Brian Epstein was trying to get the Beatles together in 1964 with Elvis, because John Lennon loved Elvis, and so did the other Beatles, but John was passionate about Elvis, because John used to listen to Elvis when he was in Liverpool on a little transistor radio, when Elvis's music was played on a channel called Radio Luxembourg. Now, that's a bit of history, because believe it or not, the BBC did not play rock and roll. I mean, it's amazing to think today. So John was passionate about meeting Elvis. 64, when they traveled, there was no time. Elvis was making movies. The Beatles were touring frantically. The next year, I get a call from Mal Evans, the road manager. "Come over, Ivor. We're going to finally get to see Elvis." And off we go to see Elvis.
When you were there, were the Memphis Mafia there?
The Memphis Mafia were there. To be honest with you, it wasn't until a bit later that I realized they were all the Memphis Mafia. They were a bunch of guys that Elvis had around him that were pals from his hometown of Memphis. And the Memphis Mafia phrase, I think, was evolved a bit later. Elvis was there. This woman, a young woman, a kind of a teenage woman with hair about 6 feet high, was there. And Elvis introduced us to her, and it was Priscilla, the woman who became his wife. I mean, she wore a beehive that you needed, it was like climbing Everest. And that was the style of the period. And Elvis was there. And when we got there, when John and we all sat around, and nobody introduced the Beatles to Elvis. And Elvis was watching television on a giant 16-inch screen. I mean, 16 inches was big then on television. But what was more amazing was that Elvis had in his hand a magic wand. It was a remote control. And again, we didn't have in England in 1965, and I hope somebody, if I'm wrong, please correct me. And the Beatles were astonished that Elvis kept changing channels in his hand rather than go up to the screen and press it. Anyway, so they stuck around, and they finally, after 15 minutes, Elvis got up and said, "You guys came here to jam. I'm going to bed if we're not going to jam." And of course, that broke the ice. and they started playing music, and Ringo didn't have his drums, so he went on and played snooker in the other room, and they jammed for about 20 minutes and the ice was broken. But I must say, at the time, again, history, you know, when you're living history, you don't realize you're living history. The reason why Elvis was a little bit cool to the Beatles was, number one, the Beatles had knocked him off the top of the hit parade. He was the king, he was no longer the king. And number two, Elvis made 35 fairly low-key movies, all the same, different leading lady, new songs maybe, same story. And the Beatles made one movie, Hard Day's Night, and they were a smash hit. So what I didn't know, and I only realized later on, was that Elvis was jealous of the Beatles. And that's why maybe there was a little bit of tension in the air to begin with.
It's hard to take that in now. I know, obviously, his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, was sort of the leading light behind Elvis with everything. But I can't quite see how. I mean, here he is. I mean, that's a whole story.
There he is, the man himself. He was a carnival showman.
He was, yeah.
But Elvis was his meal ticket.
Yeah, he was
a real character.
He was a bright cookie. I don't know whether you can confirm this. The story is the reason that Elvis never left America was because Colonel Parker, that's not his real name, because he's a Dutch immigrant, he never had a passport.
That's absolutely right. And even though Elvis made a lot of money, huge amounts of money, they never went overseas because Parker was worried that if they came back, what an embarrassment it would be if the customs said, hey, you know, you're not down here, you're not on our records. And that would have been an embarrassment beyond belief. So as a result of that, he avoided totally allowing Elvis to travel overseas. And the only time Elvis traveled overseas was when he spent his couple of years in the army as a conscript.
Yeah, and that was in Germany.
Yes.
But tell me how, because I know Brian Epstein came with you to the house. So how did Epstein and Parker get on? And I know they had a mutual interest.
Well, they had a mutual interest. And the interesting thing I remember was that Elvis was Colonel Parker's meal ticket. Elvis was the only one he handled. Brian was handling the Beatles. He was handling Billy J. Kramer. He was handling, what's the name of the lady who was terrific? I'm sorry, I've got a...
Cilla Black.
Cilla Black. And Parker said to Brian, Brian, why don't you concentrate on your boys? Why are you handling several other people? So that was the only criticism that Parker gave to Brian. And, but, you know, Brian still was, you know, attached at the umbilical cord with the Beatles. But that was funny. Two different men. Colonel Parker was a carny, fairground, blustering guy, and who did well for Elvis, but he also did well for Colonel Parker.
Yeah, well, on that subject of doing well for himself, they shared an interest, didn't they? They had a habit that they both enjoyed playing.
Well, yes. I mean, you tell me. I mean, are you talking about? I mean, Parker was a huge gambler, by the way.
Yeah, I'm referring to that. And I'm referring also to the first time that Epstein saw something, that the dining table opened up.
Oh, yes, that was funny. Yes, I've forgotten about that. I'm glad you reminded me. Yeah, the thing is, Brian was impressed because when we went in the other room, I mean, the Beatles were in the living room with Elvis, and when we walked into the other room where the billiard table was, he opened up, and it was a gambling, you know, it was a gambling table. It was a double purpose thing. And so they ended up gambling and enjoying themselves while the Beatles were in the other room doing their thing with Elvis.
So everybody was happy. Well, around the same time that this was happening, the Beatles met a certain American folk singer, another Jewish boy who changed his name from Robert Zimmerman, and he became Bob Dylan. And it was Bob Dylan who introduced the Beatles to marijuana. And I believe you've got a funny story about a conversation between Bob Dylan and John Lennon involving some lyrics.
Well, the background to that story was Bob Dylan introduced the Beatles to high-grade marijuana cigarettes. And when the Beatles, when he came to see the Beatles in their hotel, he produced a fat cigarette, and the Beatles said they'd never smoked before. Well, okay, maybe they hadn't, because in Germany, in Hamburg, it was mostly drugs to stay awake. And so Dylan said, but one of your songs is I Get High with a little help from my friends. I think that's it. Or something like I Get High. And then he said, don't you sing about I Get High? And the Beatles said, no, you don't understand. The lyrics are not I get high. I can't hide. So Dylan had interpreted the lyrics one way, but they were the other way. Anyway, long story short, we're at the hotel. Dylan brings out this fat cigarette. He gives it to Ringo. And Ringo, not knowing the protocol of smoking marijuana, smokes the whole cigarette himself. Doesn't pass it around the room. And by the time poor Ringo does that, he is on his back giggling. But fortunately, Dylan bought a good stash of marijuana cigarettes, and then everybody, including Brian, got to imbibe. And when they started to leave, they were all in, how should we say, high spirits.
I think you were there on another occasion when they were talking about the Sergeant Pepper, and they were talking about what they were going to put on the front cover. And who was going to be on the
Sergeant
front
Pepper,
cover.
of course, came a little bit later than that. And the interesting story about Sergeant Pepper, which I learned from Jan Hayworth, who was the American-born wife of the British artist Peter Blake, and they were responsible for that marvelous cover with all the faces. But I must tell you a quick story, if I may, about that. So I know we may be running out of time. Maybe we can do this as a 15-part series in the next 15 years. Anyway, so Hayworth and Blake said to the Beatles, tell us who you want on the cover. Well, the Beatles actually, believe it or not, didn't really bother. But what happened was John Lennon said, well, what about putting Hitler on the cover? And Brian said, no way, Jose. He didn't actually say no way, Jose. That's my phrase. And the amazing thing is that then they have a football player, a soccer player from Liverpool on, and a real mixed bag of people. So that cover is probably the most famous cover in the world, isn't it, Morris?
It is, absolutely. Can we go, Nicola, can we go back one page to get that cover back? Get the album cover back? Well, if we can't, not a problem if we can't. Do you recall the oh, here it comes. Okay, you see the drum on the front? That was sold. That was sold in Christie's in 2008, and it sold for 1.7 million. Just the drum.
My gosh, that is astonishing. You know, now that you've told me that, I could kick myself, Morris, because I never kept the Beatles wigs. I never kept the programs. I never kept the tickets. And I always say my biggest regret about traveling with the Beatles was that I did not take my iPhone camera with me.
That's funny, yeah. Yeah. Okay, let's move away from the Beatles a little bit, because you remained in the States, and the year now is 1968, and you were there on another absolute pivotal moment in American history. You were actually at the Ambassador Hotel, Los Angeles, for a terribly sad occasion. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yes, there is Senator Robert Kennedy, and I traveled with Senator Robert Kennedy because we all knew he was going to become the heir apparent to his assassinated brother's throne. He was going to become president. He was a great guy to travel with. People loved him. And in Los Angeles, after the election, we heard that he had won and he was going to go on to the Chicago convention of the Democratic Party and be crowned as their presidential candidate, and it probably would have won. But something happened on the night after Bobby told us. We were with him. Bobby said to us, thank you for your support. and on to Chicago, where the Democratic Party was having their convention, where they would have nominated him as their candidate. And as I followed him into a kitchen area to have a press conference in another part of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles on that June night, I heard 6 balloons popping, and I heard a screaming, and I walked 10 steps to the kitchen, got into the kitchen, and there was screaming, there was panic. A woman kept shouting, "Not again, not again, not again." And I looked around, and there on the floor, bleeding, in the arms of his pregnant wife, Ethel Kennedy, was Bobby Kennedy, looking bad. And in another corner, there was a bunch, about 10 people on the body of somebody who was struggling. And Harry Benson, the photographer that I mentioned to you earlier, was on the kitchen table taking pictures with Ethel screaming, "Give him air." Bedlam reigned. 24 hours later, it was announced that Bobby was dead. It's one of those incidents that you never forget. It was horrible, but as a journalist, you write your story, you phone your story, and that was the end of Bobby Kennedy's run for the president.
Well, on a similar subject about unpleasant things, you wrote a book called 5 to Die. And the significance of this book was to do with the Manson murders. And our mutual friend, Leslie Cavendish, certainly knows a lot more about the story, the build up to it. But your book was so scrupulously detailed that it was used by the Los Angeles District Attorney as a blueprint for the prosecution. And I think something happened to you personally on day 1 of the trial.
Well, here's the amazing thing. I covered the trial of the Charles Manson murders, and Charles Manson and his gang murdered the beautiful pregnant actress Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant, and she was the wife of the Oscar-winning film director Roman Polanski. And the Manson gang murdered several other people, friends of Sharon Tate. The amazing thing is that I got into court. I had written this book, and in the book I chronicle that Manson, and this is hard to believe, Manson used the Beatles' White Album lyrics to brainwash his devotees, who believed that what he said, that the Beatles are sending him secret messages in the recordings, that there was going to be a riot between black and white, and there would be rivers of blood and people would die. And when I wrote about it, I thought, this is crazy. I mean, demented minds. But then I sit in the courtroom and I see the district attorney presenting this philosophy, this reason that the Beatles kind of made me do it, which is, and I thought, what rubbish. Well, I mean, I can't believe this happened. But of course, what happened was the jury believed that this was the thesis of the murder, the reason behind the killings. And they convicted Manson and the girls for the murders. And I still to this day believe it was crazy. But this is the madness that went on in the Manson family. So it's a beggar's belief, this whole story. But it happened, it's part of history. And to answer your other question, I wrote the book. And in the book, I wrote what I just told you, that the Beatles' music was used to orchestrate the murders, allegedly. And when I got to the court on the first day, Squeaky Frommie, who was one of Charles Manson's devotees and still is to this very day a believer in Manson, she looked at me and she'd seen the book and she said, "Do you know what it feels like to have a sharp knife down your throat?" Well, I took that as a threat. And I told my wife, Sally, to take my daughter, Rebecca, only a year old, and go and move in with some friends. And I was scared because a lot of the devotees of Manson were still free. And as was proven later on, they could have created havoc in other people's lives. And that's briefly the story.
Well, let's go to a happier note because I think we need to. We're going to go on to 1975, and you interviewed a wonderful genius. Now, he was celebrating a very special occasion. What's the special occasion, a new suit for him?
Well, yes, I mean, this is a happier time. In 1975, yes, Charlie Chaplin was coming back to Hollywood because they finally gave him an honorary Oscar. And so I went to the Oscars and I covered the Oscars. And in those days, a reporter was able to go to the after Oscar party. And by the way, when Charlie Chaplin got his Oscar, everybody, and I was in the auditorium, everybody rose to their feet and gave him about 8-minute applause, 8 minutes live television while they applauded Chaplin. There were tears in his eyes. Fast forward 2 hours later, we're at the party. I sit down at the table with Chaplin and he is in tears. He's got his Oscar in his hands and he says, I didn't want to come back. And the reason he didn't want to come back is what they had banned him because of his beliefs, his political beliefs, because he married young women, because they considered him an undesirable. They'd thrown him out the country. And Charlie finally came back and he said, I didn't want to come back, but my daughter and my wife, Una was the wife and the daughter was, and that's Geraldine, the actress, said, come back, Dad. And he said, I'm glad I came back. And it was a moment, again, you're sitting there with the greatest comic of the century, and he is in tears and joyful at the same time, a moment of wonder.
That's a lovely story. Now, tell us briefly, because you also met a certain legend that we know as the Duke.
Yes. Oh, the Duke. The Duke. I thought you were going to talk about Prince Charles, but no.
No, not that one.
Not that one. Well, I want to tell you a quick story about the Duke. He had this reputation for being a rugged, wild man. And I went to his house one day and he'd made a movie in England. It was about a cop from Chicago who goes over to England to solve a case. And the film was about to open. So he invited me to his house for dinner, which was great. So we had dinner at John Wayne's house where he talked about the film. He had a few too many drinks and he got very maudlin. And he said to me, I want to show you something, beauty. I want to show you what beauty is. And I thought, what's he going to show me? He's going to show me a horse, a wild horse. He came back with a coffee table book of ballerinas. And he turned to a picture of Margot Fonteyn, Dame Margot Fonteyn. He said to me, this is what is beauty. And I thought, here is the rugged, no nonsense cowboy actor. And he is oodling over pictures of Dame Margot Fonteyn. And that was it. I mean, unfortunately, he died of cancer, a few years later, but he was a real character. I mean, larger than life.
You use the term beauty, and in fact, that's a great term because we're going to come on to a beauty now because you spent a little bit of time with one of the absolute greats, and here is a beautiful woman.
Yes, Elizabeth. Yeah. Elizabeth, who started out, as many people know, as a child star, came to Hollywood, conquered Richard Burton, divorced Richard Burton, remarried Richard Burton. I'm being a bit facetious here. She was a character. By the time I got to meet her, I traveled with her to the American Midwest, where she was promoting perfume, a new perfume. But what she loved to do is hang out with women. So all the women came to the department store and she sat around talking to them. And one of the women said to Elizabeth, I always remember this, Elizabeth, why did you marry so many men? Why did you get married so often? And she said, well, I'm an old-fashioned girl. When I sleep with a guy, I have to marry him. So I thought that was kind of funny. But then I saw her on films consequently when she married and divorced Burton. And she was a riot. She complained about photographers using ugly pictures of her, but she was like, you meet a woman anywhere and she complained about using fat pictures, but she was funny, she was outspoken, she was brazen, and she was a great actress.
Well, speaking of greats, possibly the greatest boxer of all time, you had the pleasure of meeting in 1980. You were privileged to interview him. Now, where did this take place? And did he give you a hard time?
He gave me a hard time, Muhammad Ali, when I got to his house, and he was on the phone, and I was supposed to spend time with him. He was on the phone for 45 minutes as I listened. And at the end of it, he said to me, I can't do an Ali voice, I wouldn't try. He said, you know, you've got an hour's interview with me and you've already used up 45 minutes. And I said, you've been on the phone. And then he smiled and he was pulling my leg. And then I spent the time on the road with Ali, and it was amazing to see his popularity. One quick story. We are in busy rush hour traffic. I am sitting, and I have a picture of this to prove it. I kid you not. I am sitting in his car. He is driving me in his convertible Rolls Royce around the streets of LA. And suddenly we come to a traffic light in busy rush hour traffic, open convertible, Rolls Royce convertible. We're in the car. A huge, gigantic garbage truck with two guys behind the wheel comes and stops next to him at the light. They turn around, they do a double take. They scream, they jump out of their truck. They come over to Ali. The light has turned green, but who cares? They hug him, they talk to him. There's a traffic jam for 3 miles going back. And then after about 4 minutes, they get back in their truck and leave. That was the way people reacted to Ali. But I'm going to tell you one quick story, which is kind of a bitter end to the story. During one of his fights, and for the Daily Express, I used to cover a lot of the heavyweight fights, which were fun. After one of the fights, Muhammad said to me, he was Cassius Clay at the time, he said, you know, I'm not going to end up like Joe Louis. And Joe Louis was a great heavyweight boxer. The Brown Bomber is what they called Joe Louis. Joe Louis ended up broke after earning a lot of money. He was a greeter at a Las Vegas casino, Caesar's Palace. And Ali said, I'm not going to end up like that. Well, the tragedy is that he ended up worse than Joe Louis. He ended up, as a result of taking too many punches, with terrible, terrible Parkinson's disease. He couldn't speak. He could hardly move. It was a tragic footnote. But what a guy, what a career. And I know we don't have that much time, but spending time with him, and I found my notes, he was entertaining, funny, witty, brilliant, and what a boxer. So that's the Ali story that most people know about. What a character.
And that's how we want to remember him. I've got one last guy that I do want to mention, and I do want to talk about, because he's very important again in American history, because you were one of the boys on the bus, because you spent quite a lot of time following a gentleman who was then bidding to become governor of California, and then went on to become the 40th president of the United States.
At the time, yeah, I mean, I must say, Ronald Reagan was affable, amiable. I mean, he had a quip. And I thought to myself, what are they doing to put an actor up for president? Because he'd already become governor and he showed that he actually had a great wit. But on the bus, he was charming. He came to see us. He talked to us, on the boys on the bus, the press guys. But in later, and I'm sorry to keep ending, I always seem to end up with Muhammad Ali about a sad story, and with Ronald Reagan, a sad story, because I remember going with Ronald Reagan when the Queen came to see him in Santa Barbara, California, and he took her up a muddy road to the Reagan Ranch in Santa Barbara, California. So one thing, again, a story, and I'm sorry to harp on this, but there were signs that Ronnie was suffering from Alzheimer's. And although this is out of balance and being on the road with Reagan was great, I remember standing there with Reagan and with Nancy, and somebody asked him a tough political question. I think it was about the Iran-Contra problems. And by that time, Ronnie was a little bit forgetful. And I stood there and I watched when somebody asked him a tricky question, about the Iran-Contra situation. And Ronnie was absolutely befuddled, but Nancy whispered in his ear, "We're doing what we can." And Ronnie said, "It's a tricky problem, but we're doing what we can." And that was the last time I saw Ronnie in person. And I'm sorry to end on that note, but on the road, he was remarkable.
Well, okay, I need to get in conclusion now with something. And I'm going to ask you a very, very, very deep-rooted question. And that is, I want you to share with us what you consider to be your finest achievement.
Well, I think my finest achievement, boy, you threw that one, was marrying Sally. And that's Sally. And that's
What a pretty lady.
Sally Ogle Davis from Northern Ogle, Sally Ogle before she became Davis. I met her at Butlins holiday camp. She was working before going to university as a sales girl. And the moment I saw her, that was it.
Well, I can relate to that. I can understand why. What a pretty girl. Is that picture actually in the grounds of Butlins?
Yes, it's in Butlins holiday camp in 1960, summer of 60, when I met her. She went to university, Queen's University, Belfast. She graduated she went on to become a BBC television anchor woman. And then it took me 7 years to propose to her, but that's another story. But anyway.
Why did you rush it so much?
Yeah, I was a slow coach, as we used to say. And I'm delighted that it turned out to be the way it did.
With that, it's virtually taken us almost full circle from where we started.
Yes.
So, wow, I mean, what more can I say about an evening such as this and what a life you've had? And thank you, Ivor, for sharing such wonderful memories with us. It has been an absolute pleasure and unparalleled delight to interview you. And I would urge all our listeners to, and people who all around the country, wherever they are, buy your books, read them, see the articulate way that you write, because it has been an absolute pleasure. So Ivor, from me, a big, big thank you, because I've loved it. And now, if you're ready and it's okay with you, I'd like to bring back Dahlia, because I'd like to have some Q&A from our audience, if that's okay with you.
I am back
and
with
I'll say
you.
goodbye to you at the end. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Maurice. Thank you so, so much. I love the depth of research that you do before these events that you hold. So thank you, Maurice, for another fine job. Ivor, we've got quite a few questions. So are you ready to dive in?
I'm ready to rumble.
Okay. So first of all, you have got a message from Leslie Cavendish, who's in our audience tonight. He wants you to know that your hair looks really nice.
What about mine, Leslie?
Dahlia, can you ask him if I come to England, would he give me a discount haircut?
Yeah, well,
because
he does.
He's the famous barber to the Beatles.
I know, and he describes himself. He says, "Hi, Ivor, it's your barber, Leslie Cavendish." So he actually asks, "Is there anything that you miss about London?"
I do miss. I mean, I love the theatre, and I miss going to the theatre. I mean, I miss whenever I go on a visit to London, being the cheap character that I am. I hang out in Leicester Square a lot, but my God, that's it. And of course, I have my sister, who I miss.
Yeah. Yep. I can understand. When I lived in America, I missed my brothers. It's hard. Yep. Okay, yeah. We've got a Beatles question. Maureen and Stuart are asking, who would you say was the more dominant, Lennon or McCartney?
I think John Lennon was the most dominant because he didn't mind saying whatever came to mind. Paul was a diplomat. So whenever something offended John, he would say it. And he would say it in a somewhat outrageous way because he was sort of his lips were uncensored. So now behind the scenes with Brian, I think they were probably equals, but certainly publicly, John was the powerhouse.
And what a loss to all of us
Yeah.
to think of what could have been with a mind like that. Yeah. Moving, actually another Beatles question from Marsha, who would like to know, did you stay in touch with any of the Beatles after they returned to the UK?
I did not stay in touch with them because I'm sure a lot of people, too many people stayed in touch, but I did. I mean, I saw Paul 18 months ago before lockdown and went backstage and chatted to him, and he was great. I mean, he introduced me to his wife. Here's my wife, as if, oh, is that your wife? I would never have known. Nancy, thank you. I mean, it's kind of funny, really. And then we talked about the old days, and then I went to see Ringo on one occasion, but I've seen Ringo twice, actually. And the thing about Ringo, I must tell you, is that Ringo's career is also humming along in top gear because Ringo is very shrewd. He does Ringo and the All-Star Band. He brings in great young musicians. He gets on stage. He leaves the stage for about half an hour and lets them have their moment in the sun, and then he comes back because everybody who's gone to a Ringo concert wants to see Ringo. And I must tell you, just jumping back to Paul and seeing him at that concert, Paul McCartney gives you value for money. Paul McCartney is on stage for 3 hours, 15 minutes. And so they're both hugely active. I think they'll never stop. And they give money for value because even though the ticket prices are slightly higher, $2.50 in 1964, 2,500 in 2021. Amazing.
Yes.
It's inflation, I think, Dalia.
I think it's perhaps slightly higher than the rate of inflation. Yes. Right. Although, you know, next time we get a pay raise, we can base it on that rate of inflation, perhaps.
I think you should do that, definitely.
Okay, I'll ask. You never know.
Okay. Let me know, would you please?
Okay, will do. Marsha wants to know, when you were at Butlins, did you ever dream that you'd go on to have such an amazing career?
Not really. I mean, Butlins was great fun. I think I may have got, I don't know, maybe 10 quid a week. But the great thing about Butlins, I could be the big macher. You know, when journalists came to Butlins, and that was my job to publicize it, I could take them out to dine at the Butlins Chinese restaurant. So, you know, I was a big shot. So I'm kidding a little bit, but no, I never dreamed. Thanks for the question. I never, whoever thunk it, as I say, who knew? Mm-hmm. Never did.
And you've been living in the US for how long now?
Well, I've been living in the US for about nearly 60 years.
Amazing.
60 years. Oh my God. You know, I must tell you a quick story. I know I'm sorry to maybe there are other questions. So one year when I was much younger, I went to interview the Jewish Oscar-winning director John Schlesinger, who lived in Palm Springs, California. And he had left to make his mark, to make great movies, Darling, some great films, Midnight Cowboy. And we were sitting having tea in his house. And he said, you know, Ivor, the problem with living in California is that you go to bed when you're 23, and then the next day you wake up and you're 83. And you know what? He was right.
We have, here we go, Priscilla. Yes, Priscilla is saying something that I was thinking. Amazing that you haven't lost your British accent after all this time in America. Absolutely true.
Well, yeah, you know, yeah, but a lot of people think I'm South African, but or even Australian, but I'm a better Australian accent. Yeah, I have not lost my accent, but yeah. Hopefully, because I think the fact that I came when I was 21, I was already set in concrete. But if I'd been a child that came to America, I think I would have spoken. I mean, you were a mature young lady when you were in Chicago, right?
Right. I moved there when I was 23, I think I was.
Okay, and so you were set, weren't you?
Yes, yeah, you don't. Yeah. Your accent doesn't change. Whereas my son,
right.
who moved from Chicago to England when he was 6, almost 7, had the most beautiful London accent within 6 months.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. Okay.
So yeah, I think when you move somewhere as an adult, you stick with what you know.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. But do you import Cadbury's chocolate? Because I certainly did.
I do, and in fact, I have a shop in my hometown where when they get Mars bars in, they call me.
Oh, perfect.
And I go down and buy. I mean, I never did this in England. I buy half a dozen Mars bars, put them in the fridge, and they last me at least 2 weeks.
Yeah. So I made sure that my son was a Marmite baby. So I had my brothers send me Marmite to America. Yeah, it's important. These things matter. Let's move back to the questions. Robert wants to know, having met the Beatles, I'm curious, did you report on or go and see the Rolling Stones?
The answer to that question is no. But but in 1960, middle of 60s, the only time I got involved with the Rolling Stones was when I went to Australia. The Daily Express sent me to Australia because Marion Faithfull had taken an overdose. Well, Mick Jagger had gone to Australia to make a movie called Ned Kelly. He was playing the title. Well, first of all, and I don't want to over answer this question. So I met Mick in Australia, but he wasn't too happy to talk to me because Marion Faithfull was in a coma for 6 days. She came out of it and she's still around today. And Mick is still around today because he's going on tour again. I mean, I can't believe Mick Jagger. And also, as the world knows, Mick, not only is he touring again very shortly, but he had a new child about 2 years ago. So Mick is running on all pistons.
Yes, he certainly is. That's one way to describe it. Let's end with a question that has been asked by a couple of people, and I think we all want to know. Richard, Estrin, and Priscilla are both asking, is there anything that you haven't done or anyone that you haven't met yet that you would like to?
You know, it's an interesting question. I've never met Barack Obama. I'd like to meet him. I'd like to sit down with him and talk to him because, I mean, he's an incredible guy. I mean, here is the first twice elected. So Barack Obama, okay, I'd love to see him. And to be honest with you, in the new wave of entertainers, there's nobody that has made me get excited. But of course, you know, I'm not 20 years of age anymore. So the answer to that question, both to Robert and Priscilla, is there's nobody particularly. I mean, I'd love to sit down with Jane Fonda now, and I might do that because I knew her when she was Barbarella back in the 60s, and ask her about her life. But I'm sorry that I can't come up with a pat answer, but that's it. Barack Obama, and that's about it. Give me more time, and I'll come back with another answer. But thank you anyway. And again, as I said at the beginning, what a pleasure that Morris so dedicatedly and conscientiously has prepared all this stuff. And I hope it's been interesting. And again, as I said at the beginning, Dahlia, thank you for inviting me on. And I can't urge those listening, tuning in to donate to this superb charity, which does such incredible work in Israel. And thank you for inviting me.
Ivor, you've been incredible. You have kept us all on the edge of our seat with your stories. I don't think anyone could boast such an impressive list of friends and acquaintances as you have. And thank you so much for spending your Monday late morning with us. What a way to start the week. Thank you so much for giving your time to us. It's been absolutely incredible. Morris, thank you again for your hard work on this and for making the initial contact with Ivor. Thank you to Leslie for the introduction that allowed that to happen. Also, I want to thank the committee that has worked hard to put on all of these events, and to my team in the office, which is Deborah now. Those of you who know Nicola has moved on to progress her career with another charity, but I do want to thank her because she's volunteering her time with these events to help us, because we need the background technical help, and she has once again done a brilliant job with the slides and all of the background technical stuff, all really whilst adjusting to a new job. So thank you so much, Nicola. You're a superstar. I knew that when I hired you. To everyone who's been with us this evening, I want to say thank you for joining us. I want to encourage you to stay in touch with us. We've got some amazing events coming up. On November 22nd, Morris will be interviewing Chris Tarrant. I am old enough to remember Tiswas and everything since then. So definitely that will be a fun one. On the 13th of December, we have Alan Titchmarsh. So you can ask your questions and start planning your garden for next summer. And then in January is the month where we mark Holocaust Memorial Day, and we have two really special events lined up. We have Eva Schloss joining us. Eva is herself a Holocaust survivor and will be sharing her story. She's also the stepsister of Anne Frank. And so she's very kindly offering to share an evening with us and sharing her story. And then we are rounding off the month with a second interview, actually, with the author Heather Morris. Heather wrote The Tattooist of Auschwitz, which is an international bestseller. And Heather has just published another book. She also followed up with Silke's Journey, but she now has a new book out called Three Sisters, where she follows the story of three sisters who also survived the Holocaust and are still with us. And she is coming back from Australia, joining us again from Australia to talk about her new book and all of the experiences she had preparing for that. So lots of fun stuff coming up. We really hope you can join us for all of it. Thank you. I'll be sending an email for those of you who'd like to make a donation to help support our work in providing for at-risk children, helping them to become productive members of Israeli society. So we're helping Israel to become stronger and tapping in to talent that would otherwise have been overlooked just due to circumstance. So thank you for all of that. I will send a link out as a follow-up to this. With all that said, thank you all very much and have a wonderful night.